Ooh, hey guys, what's up? So it's it's 2020, and I looked at the worst of the last decade in terms of horror films based on, the shit I've watched. Now it's time to go through some of the best horror films of the last decade. This is gonna be longer, probably a lot longer than the worst of the decade list. There's actually quite a few really good movies released this last decade. Let's just get this started with the year 2010. 2010 was not the biggest year for horror, but we got some pretty good international titles um, that year, and we also got quite a few titles that the horror community are still talking about quite a bit, even though it's been 10 years. Starting off, we got I Saw the Devil, which is a South Korean uh, action crime thriller horror revenge film. It runs for like 2.5 hours. It is super violent and gory. It's depressing. It is very long. Like I said, 2.5 hours. Um, it features the actor who was Odaisu in Old Boy as the main antagonist of the film. The film basically being about a Korean police officer um, and his girlfriend, wife, fiance. She's murdered by a serial killer, and he attempts to seek revenge on this killer for murdering his lover, murdering the love of his life. And um, things get very dark and violent. It becomes a kind of cat and mouse game after a while. There's all kinds of stuff in here. There's beheadings, there is cannibalism, there is torture and rape. It is rough. Um, speaking of things that are rough, on to the next film for 2010, we got a Serbian film. I know some people would want me to put a Serbian film on the worst of the decade list. And to be fair, a Serbian film is not a perfect movie by any means necessary. Um, in my opinion, it's a film that I think is good considering how much of a reputation it has. It's actually a pretty well made um, film, despite its reputation being, uh, you know, what it is. I mean, people are still talking about how disturbing a Serbian film is to this day, and it's kind of crazy that we're still talking about it. And I think that says something about it. Um, I think the director of Candyman, I think his name was Bernard Rose, um, something like that. He once said, "Horror without transgression means nothing," which I can agree with for the most part, because the thing with the horror genre is you have to surprise and shock and scare people, um, and that often involves being very transgressive. And you know, there are a lot of groundbreaking horror movies that aren't horribly violent. I think the best example I can give off the top of my head is probably um, Psycho or Peeping Tom. But then there are titles that really, you know, influence the genre. Maybe not even majorly, but quite a bit. That were a bit transgressive. Were a bit controversial, gory, excessive. Uh, Movies like Blood Feast, for example, or Cannibal Holocaust. I'm not even talking about the plot of a Serbian film. Uh, I'm sure everybody knows the plot right by now, but it's about a porn star who is retired and he's living with his family and everything, his wife and his son, and uh, he is starting to run low on funds, and in order to help provide for his family, he agrees to star in this porno art film. The director is a really shady guy, and it turns out it's a snuff film. Um, and a lot of disgusting, horrific things happen in this movie that I can't even sit here and try to defend. Um, and this is coming from a guy who defends Salo till his last breath. Let's just leave it at that. Some of these I have more to say about than others because I haven't seen some of these in a while. This next one, Beyond the Black Rainbow, also from 2010. This one I do have a decent amount to say about. This was the directorial debut of Panos Cosmatos, who is the son of the guy who I'm pretty sure directed Tombstone, as well as Rambo 2 and a few other movies. He's a pretty well-known director. And this guy made this movie in 2010. It was his first film, and it is a weird mix of, like, 60s retrofuturism with surreal kind of science fiction horror elements. There's even like an entire section of the film that is a reference to Begotten, which is this really surreal film from the 90s that's pretty disturbing. It's essentially about a girl who's trapped in this complex for some reason by a doctor who may or may not be fucking insane. And she attempts to escape, and through attempting to escape, she goes through in this facility and sees and experiences many weird, surreal things that are like a combination of some of the set pieces in 2001: A Space Odyssey, combined with the segment of This Night I'll Possess Your Corpse, where Coffin Joe goes to hell. It's not a perfect movie. It's kind of slow, and there's a lot of needless extra stuff, but it's a really great movie visually. And the thing that inspired the director to do this movie was when he was younger, he used to go to the video store with his parents, and he would always look at the horror VHS tapes and look at the cover art. He was never allowed to rent them, but he would always wonder, what would that movie be like? And that's what he was trying to create, is a film, is what he thinks, a film from that he would see in the video store would feel like, would look like, would be as a film. And it's an interesting kind of experiment. Next we have another one. This one's also pretty disturbing. This is a Japanese film from director Shion Sono, who is one of my favorite Japanese directors, without a doubt. I'm talking about Cold Fish, which is his film he made based on a series of actual murders that were committed in Japan. The film has to do with a guy who owns this small, fish shop. He sells fucking exotic fish as pets, and he ends up befriending this guy who owns this larger, more corporate fish shop, this more corporate place. And through a chance meeting, they decide to start working together. And this movie runs for about 2.5 hours. It's very depressing. It's very violent. And it turns out that this guy who owns the corporate fish shop may or may not be a absolute fucking monster, and a serial killer. Same with his wife. And never before have I seen a movie where a man is told, hey, you're gonna be a millionaire. A man is told that he's going to be very rich. I've never seen a movie where a man is told that, and it's depressing. Like, if a character gets told that in any other movie, it's like a joyous thing. Like, this character's finally getting what they deserve, what they've wanted all along. This is like, it's actually depressing to hear that. And the character is not really overjoyed to hear it either. But yeah, that's Cold Fish. Next we have The Skin I Live In, which is a film from, I believe it is from Spain. And this movie is another one that is that is considered to be a disturbing movie. It essentially has to do with Antonio Banderas, who is the main character. He is holding a woman captive in his house and performing medical experiments on her. but everything is not what it seems to be, and that's the best I can put it. Because there is so much going on in the skin I live in that I don't want to like even try to discuss the plot further than he's holding a woman captive and performing medical experiments on her, because any further than that it ruins the film, and it also ruins the surprise, the shock, um, of what is going on, and it's disturbing, it's depressing, it's fucked. I feel like it's going to be the main theme of this uh, fucking video. Next we have Adam Wingard's Youre Next, which was a slasher film I saw out of the blue. I rented it from Redbox, and I was like, this might be an interesting movie. And I was kind of just hoping for kind of a formulaic, cookie cutter, average slasher flick. But what I found was actually a very fun, thrilling, somewhat self-aware film that I would definitely say is one of my favorite slasher films of all time. And it essentially has to do with a family reunion, everybody getting back together. And it follows one particular son in the family and his wife, who has a very interesting past. Something's going on, though. There are people around the house and outside the house, and these people want them dead. I'll put it that way. Youre Next is kind of something. It's kind of a film that people fairly know of fairly well, and I'm not trying to like sit here and say it's one of the greatest films ever made, but it's definitely one of the gems of the last decade in terms of slasher films that we've got in the last decade. Next we have Kill List from 2011. This film was directed by I think Ben Wheatley. I'm probably wrong. This film has to do with a hitman who is basically going about his day, doing his jobs, doing what he has to. The horror elements don't come on really strong until the ending, but damn is that ending something. Okay. Where are we now? 2012. 2012 was a good year. In 2012, we got fucking Richard Bates Jr. We got his debut feature film, Excision, which is legitimately a masterpiece of modern kind of dark comedy, gross out horror. Excision is a weird psychological kind of character study that's like a cross between like the Greasy Strangler and I guess I'm gonna have to say Ginger Snaps. I would feel like that's a decent comparison to draw. Having to do with a young girl who is having to do with a girl. She's in high school, Pauline. Her mother hates her pretty much, completely disapproves of what she wants to do and what she wants to be. She doesn't want to be ladylike like her mother wants. She just, Pauline wants to, be a surgeon, and she wants to be the best surgeon she can be. One of the scenes very early on, which I think perfectly sets the tone for the rest of the movie, is a scene where Pauline is in class and they're learning about like STDs or something like that. They're learning about safe sex. They're in sex ed, and she raises her hand and asks the teacher, "Is it possible to catch an STD from a dead person?" That's the level that this film is at, and it fucking stays there for the entire runtime. It's kind of wild. Let's see. I know we got other ones that year. Yeah, that year we also got the remake of Maniac, um, which was which starred Elijah Wood. This is one of the most surprising horror remakes I've ever seen, and one of the horror remakes that I would say almost improves upon the original. The original Maniac is a film I very much love. I think it's a really interesting, gritty, disturbing character study of this misogynistic serial killer stalking New York, and it's just I mean, it's gritty, it's grimy, it's dirty. You know, if there's something that I've always said about like exploitation throwback films is that they will never be able to match the dirty, low budget, grimy feeling of movies like Maniac or Last House on Dead End Street or um, I Spit on Your Grave. Like, there's no replicating that feeling. At least not 99% of the time. So, for the remake of Maniac, they turned it into almost this, like, semi-art house, surrealist kind of psychological horror slasher film. Essentially with Elijah Wood playing Frank Zito, who is a serial killer. You also get to learn more about Frank's past in this version than you do in the original. And you find out why he has mannequins all over the place, which in this version he sells mannequins, which was like his mother's store before she passed away, and everything. And you learn more about Frank's mother. You know, I mean, it's obvious in the original film that she was abusive and she was a prostitute. In this version, it goes even further with him hallucinating that she is there, and like in the streets, like literally he's walking down the street and he fucking sees her and a man groping her and she tells him to look away. It's surreal as hell, and it's also interesting because it's from the perspective of Frank. Like, the movie is, I want to say, almost 90% from a first-person perspective, which I think is a really interesting way to go about remaking a film like Maniac. Because already, you know, with the original film, you felt like you were there. And with this version, you literally are there. It's pretty crazy, and it's a lot more stylized and artistic, which is a very interesting way to go about it. Honestly, the only thing I that's a negative about it is the fact that it just can't replicate that style, and that's the big thing. In 2012, we got The Battery, which is a film that not a lot of people really talk about or know about, and I think that's kind of a shame, because this is a really this is actually a pretty underrated zombie comedy film, like zombie comedy road movie, essentially about these two baseball players who are traveling this zombie infested wasteland, trying to find somewhere to, you know, take shelter. And in the meantime, they're dealing with each other's bullshit. It's a somewhat absurd, somewhat surreal, somewhat art house feeling, but mostly fun. Zombie comedy, essentially, with these two negative, not negative, but these two opposite personalities constantly clashing and having to work together in order to survive. The ending is also like this really great mixture of humorous and bleak, and I really, really dig that about it. Let's see. Going on to 2013, we got Under the Skin, which is inarguably one of the most heavy on the atmosphere and uncomfortable films of the last decade. It's definitely an art house film. It's not for everybody. The screen is like black for a lot of the runtime of the movie, and if you can't, you know, get into it, then this is not going to be something for you. Under the Skin is a film that stars Scarlett Johansson as an alien wearing a woman's skin, and she kind of just goes around picking up men and sleeping with them, and it's kind of implied that she also kills and eats them in order to learn what it is to truly be human. And that's kind of the entire film. It's about what it means to be human. There's also some stuff in there about, you know, about stuff involving gender and feminism, which I'm not an expert on, so I'm not even going to try to touch that. But it's a really great, very uncomfortable film, and the music is absolutely fucking horrifying, and I love it. Also in 2013, we got the Evil Dead remake, another remake, just like with Maniac, that I think really stands head and shoulders next to its contemporaries, and it shows that you can do a remake and you can do it well, and make it entertaining without trying to trample on everything else. I think at this point it's wild to me that the Evil Dead remake came out 7 years ago, because I remember seeing that the night it came out, and I was super, super hyped for it, and just I was ready for that film. And now here we are in 2020, and this movie is 7 years old, and yeah, it's kind of weird to me. Let's see. In 2013, we also got Return to Nukem High Volume 1, which was a very good return to form for Troma Entertainment. It kind of sucks that Return to Nukem High Volume 2, which came out in 2018 technically, which was an almost 4 to 5 year wait. It really sucks that this wait was not worth the final result, which sucked. But Return to Nukem High is basically like an abridged kind of, not an abridged, but it's a two. This entire series, Volume 1 and 2, are like is basically one big remake of the original film. However, this first one follows the original film like up until the start of the third act, and then the last film is the third act, and it just doesn't. The second one doesn't work, but the first one's very entertaining. If you like Troma movies, then I would highly recommend it, and I would also recommend it if you enjoy the class of Nukem High films. It's very enjoyable. We also have Saint Bernard from 2013, which didn't get its official release to the masses until literally 2019. 6 years. 6 years for one of what is arguably one of the greatest kind of weird, low-budget art house horror films I've ever seen in my entire life. I did a review of it, so if you want to hear me bullshit about the review, if you want to hear me rave about it, I will link that in the description. Next, we're getting into 2014, we got Goodnight Mommy, which I think I reviewed that film. I can't remember too well. But Goodnight Mommy, I remember receiving quite a bit of hype when it was released. It's an Austrian horror film, essentially about these two twin brothers who, after their mother receives some kind of facial reconstructive surgery, she comes home and the two brothers believe that the person underneath the bandages is not their mother. And things get pretty weird. I mean, honestly, things get a little predictable. I'm not going to sit here and try to act like it's the most unexpected film ever. But the atmosphere is still really fucking good in the movie. And I think that it holds up as a relatively interesting, disturbing little flick. Despite it maybe not being the most original movie. From 2014 also, we got Housebound, New Zealand, supernatural horror comedy, essentially about a young woman who is put under house arrest in her mother's house after not living there for many years. And she finds out that this house may be fucking haunted. It's a very funny, very charming and entertaining little horror comedy. It's this really good mix of actually well-written comedy and good kind of gross out and or splattery, not even necessarily splattery, but I guess almost like horror parody kind of humor. But it still holds up as being both legitimately creepy and funny. Again, I have a review of that film in the description. You can check that out. We also got in 2014 Starry Eyes, which 2014, we got Starry Eyes and we got It Follows. And between the two, I prefer Starry Eyes. It's a lot more interesting and, there's a lot more going on with it. That being said, I also want to say that I want to just give It Follows a mention on here because it was a really good movie that came out in the last decade. But Starry Eyes, movie essentially about how the mainstream film industry is the devil and you are selling your soul if you attempt to, you know, like fuck over your friends who are um, independent filmmakers. If you don't want to help the independents, but you want to help the big shots, basically, it's like a weird mix of psychological, supernatural, body horror. It's like a weird mix of David Lynch and Cronenberg. It's really good, mysterious, and violent. Also in 2014, we got What We Do in the Shadows, which is a New Zealand horror comedy. We had a decent amount of horror comedies from New Zealand this past decade. We had this, we had Deathgasm, and Housebound. I know there are some others that I'm blanking on, but either way, I'm fucking stalling. What We Do in the Shadows is a mockumentary film. It's actually got a spin-off series on FX that is very, very good. I highly recommend that series as well as this film. Basically, a mockumentary film with these filmmakers documenting the daily lives of a bunch of vampires who live together, and just it's just a bunch of fun. It's fun. It's goofy. There's some really great, like, clever humor in it, and yeah, I think everybody knows about What We Do in the Shadows. Honestly, going into 2015, we got Bone Tomahawk. Bone Tomahawk, the debut film from S. Craig Zahler, who is a director that is interesting, despite there being some things about him that I really don't want to get into, that have kind of tainted his movies, especially his first two movies for me. Either way, Bone Tomahawk is this, essentially, like, combined. It's a cross genre horror western, combining elements of Italian cannibal films with spaghetti westerns. Basically, cannibal Native Americans kidnapped, Native American savages kidnap the people from this town, and it's up to the sheriff and a bunch of other people to go and save these people. The sheriff being portrayed by none other than Kurt Russell, which he's very great in this. I think you can tell the kind of problem with this movie right with that description, with it literally being cannibal Native American savages. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to say anything else. Jesus. 2015 also gave us When Blackbirds Fly, the sophomore feature from animator Jimmy Screamer-Claus. A lot of people saw Where the Dead Go to Die and were like, that's god awful. And I was going to put it on here, but in all honesty, as I personally like it. So, yeah. But When Blackbirds Fly, I feel like it's a very solid follow-up, and I feel like the animation is a lot better in the film, and it's a lot more realized in terms of its concept. Essentially, When Blackbirds Fly is this kind of hallucinogenic social horror film, essentially set in this small town called Heaven, where they're led by a kind of cult leader named Kane. And Kane leads this place. There are, propaganda posters with him on it all over the place. And they tell them not to go outside of the wall that surrounds Heaven. Well, one curious kid goes outside the wall, and it causes a bunch of crazy shit. The film is basically supposed to be a, like, propaganda film from in-universe of what would happen if somebody went outside the wall, which I think is a very interesting kind of way to do it. And, yeah, I genuinely think When Blackbirds Fly is actually, like, a really, really good, independently produced, out of pocket from Jimmy. He didn't crowdfund this film at all. He did it himself with his own money. For a movie that was made by one guy in his basement over the course of a few years, it's not bad at all. let's see, what else we got? In 2015, we also got Turbo Kid, which is a really great kind of throwback combination of like 80s post-apocalyptic movies like Mad Max with a bit of like with you know some other elements thrown in, most definitely, but it's this bright, colorful, violent, creative, entertaining little throwback kind of exploitation. It's not even necessarily really a horror film, but I'm putting it on this list because it's a fucking violent movie, and it's extremely violent. So I'm counting it. The people who made this also did a follow-up film, not a sequel to Turbo Kid, mind you, but another film called Summer of '84, which is more in the lines, more in the horror realm. It's not as good of a film, but but I'm gonna go ahead and just throw this on there on top of Turbo Kid. Summer of '84 is pretty interesting. It's like a combination of Goonies and yeah, it's like Goonies basically. It's basically Goonies, except instead of searching for pirate treasure, they're trying to prove that their neighbor is a serial killer. That's like a bleak turn, I know. 2015 also gave us The Gift, which is, I think, Joel Edgerton's directorial debut. I think it was his directorial debut. Either way, he also stars in the movie, and this is a really great kind of psychological horror thriller, essentially having to do with this guy bumping into a childhood friend he has not seen in many, many years. And, you know, they say hi, and then they start talking, you know, start spending some time together, because his wife is like, hey, why don't you invite him back, you know, him over for dinner and whatnot. And then things take a very fucking dark turn. That's all I'm gonna say. It's a pretty decently disturbing, bleak little film. 2015 also gave us what I think is probably the best horror film of the last decade, The Witch, from Robert Eggers. What am I fucking saying? What can I say about The Witch? It's fucking beautiful. It's honestly a perfect film in my opinion. And it is one of the only modern horror films that I've seen that has really gotten under my skin and fucked with me. Like that, and I want to say, when it comes to like films released in 2015, or not 2015, but films released this last decade, like that, Climax, and Suspiria are the ones that really got under my skin and messed with me in this last decade. And I know I just gave some spoilers for later in the video, but don't you worry, there's more to come. 1 second. Continuing with 2015, we got The Invitation, which is a film having to do with a guy receiving an invitation from his ex-wife to a dinner party. This is years after they've been apart, and he brings his new girlfriend, fiance along, and it turns out they've invited a bunch of other people, a bunch of old friends to this party. And you know, things are going all right, and then some shit happens. I think the problem with a lot of these movies that are like the best of is that I don't want to like just straight up spoil everything about them because they're really good if you don't know anything going in. It kind of makes it hard to talk about them. But when talking about bad movies, I can just spoil the shit out of them because I don't care. Either way, continuing with 2015, we got The Blackcoat's Daughter, which was one that I slept on when it came out. It was released by A24, who distributed The Witch and a lot of other very, very good, modern, kind of semi-art house films. They've released a lot of interesting horror films as well. And The Blackcoat's Daughter is directed by Osgood Perkins, who is the son of Anthony Perkins, as in Norman Bates from Psycho. Yeah. This is essentially a kind of classic story, classic plot, I guess you could say, having to do with this girl at an all-girls school, at an all-girls like Catholic school. She is left behind during winter break when her parents do not show up to pick her up, and perspectives keep jumping back and forth between um, these two characters. As you go along, you learn more and more about them, and the film isn't the most original movie, mind you. It's pretty decently made, pretty well made, honestly. Uh, it's not like it is the greatest film ever made or anything, but I think it's kind of a shame how A24 just completely swept this film under the rug. Um, I don't remember seeing anything about this film being released uh, at all. I just remember finding it on Amazon Prime one day and being like, "Huh, I think I've seen this film around before, maybe." Um, but yeah, that's A24 really did the Blackcoat's daughter dirty because Jesus, man, it's such a good movie, and they really just did not really release it at all. Uh, Speaking of A24, we got a film that is another one where it got a release, but it didn't get as wide of a release as it probably could have. I'm talking about Green Room. This was a movie that I saw the trailers for, and I was really excited to check out. And I heard a bunch of great things about it, and I went to see it, like the weekend that it came out at my local art house theater, and it was an absolute blast to see this film in a theater. It was really, really great, and it was a lot more intense. And I remember watching it when it hit Blu-ray, and I was like, man, this isn't as gory as I remember it. And I remember seeing it in theater and it being an absolutely just visceral, disturbing flick. But like, I mean, it still is on Blu-ray, mind you. But seeing it in the theater was just a really great experience. Essentially, the film has to do with a punk rock band that ends up playing at this skinhead Nazi bar when when one of their gigs falls through. And after witnessing a murder in the green room at this bar, they find themselves in a fight for their lives against the owners of the bar. And things get really fucked. I think I'll leave it at that. Okay, we're in 2016 now. Jeez, we're getting there. In 2016, we had a pretty decent little number of flicks. Starting off with 2016, we had The Neon Demon from Nicholas Winding Refn. This was the first film he did that was technically a horror film. The Neon Demon is a weird 2.5 hour long, like, absolute trip, because comparably to Beyond the Black Rainbow, there's a lot of stuff in this movie that is just absolutely needless. Like, you don't need all this extra bullshit in this film. But in my opinion, it's so beautifully shot and so interesting to look at that it's worth it. The movie essentially has to do with a woman, a young girl who goes to Hollywood to be a model, to become famous, and every time somebody meets her, they're asking like, "Wow, how old are you? Like you're young, I remember there being a specific part where somebody asks her, when did you have your first procedure done, as in plastic surgery? She says she's never had plastic surgery. And there's interesting things I noticed while watching the film, such as during some of the audition scenes where, she's auditioning for for essentially, she's trying, I guess an audition to be a model for a modeling gig, I guess. And when they're all just kind of sitting there waiting in the waiting room and stuff, like everybody else, all of these women who, I guess you could say are fake, all of these women are like sitting completely still. It doesn't even look like they're breathing. They are sitting as still as humanly possible. But the main character, she's kind of, twiddling her thumbs. She's, biting her nails. She looks nervous. She's moving. She's breathing. And everybody else around her looks like a fucking mannequin. And it's something really interesting. It's something really interesting I noticed about the film. In reality, the film could be boiled down to, like, 3 major scenes, and it could have been a short film. But I don't know. I kind of like all the visuals in the film. It's not as interesting as... not as good of a film as Drive, in my opinion, but I think it still holds up as being really interesting. From 2016, we also got The Greasy Strangler, which I think probably has the crown for the grossest movie of the last decade. Maybe. I don't know. Kuso, which was Flying Lotus's debut film, had some really gross moments as well. But The Greasy Strangler is an interesting kind of horror comedy. The movie is basically about this feud between this guy and his father, Braden and Ronnie, respectively, as they both fall in love with the same woman, Janet. And at the same time, there is a monster on the loose that is a naked man covered in grease who's going around strangling people. This movie is like a John Waters film, but like a lot more straightforward. It's like watching Pink Flamingos, but without the dog shit eating. Like, there's still a lot of weird, gross shit in the movie. But there's no, there's no singing asshole. There is no fucking of a live chicken. There's plenty of bizarre and very, very humorous things in this movie. I remember when I finally got my friends to watch it, we all sat around and watched it together, and it was a very great experience to watch this with my friends. And we've actually watched it together twice, and it's just as entertaining the second time. I've seen The Greasy Strangler a number of times, and I even watched it with the audio commentary track with the 2 main actors and the director, and like, they are just it's such an interesting, bizarre, disgusting movie. It was also produced by Elijah Wood, of all people. 2016 also gave us The Wailing, which is a really great Korean supernatural horror film, kind of. It's a film that, towards the last act, becomes kind of extremely confusing. And I haven't watched it since I first watched it in, like, 2017, so it's been a while. So I can't really say too much about this movie, but I remember it being really creepy and legitimately kind of brain melting, and how good, and because the thing is, the film is intentionally, the last act is intentionally very kind of broken and surreal and disjointed and confusing, because the director wanted to make the viewer feel as confused as the characters, and he does a good fucking job. There's like there's a YouTube video out there where somebody kind of completely explains what's going on in the final act. And once you get all that context, it actually makes sense. But as is, it's confusing. But it's a good movie from what I remember. I like how all this is like from what I remember of all of these movies. Train to Busan. This is a Korean zombie film. This is like the first live action film from the director, who had only done animated movies previously. And I saw his animated prequel to Train to Busan. I think it's Seoul Station, which wasn't as good. There's some interesting things about it, but it's really not as good overall. But I remember watching Train to Busan. I remember buying it, blind buy, because I'd heard really good things about it. And I was genuinely surprised by it, because it's an interesting take on the zombie genre. It's, charming. There's some genuinely, like, thrilling and action-packed moments. There's some really good moments of, like, humor in the film. essentially, it is a Korean zombie film set on a train, and you follow these characters as they are stuck on this speeding fucking train, and there are zombies. Uh, I should also mention that I actually watched this film with my mother once, and my mom is one of those average kind of Americans where, if it's subtitled, she ain't gonna watch it. But she saw the trailer for it. She was genuinely interested, and I was like, "Oh, I have that. I think it has the English dub on it." And I watched it with my mom with the English dub, and she absolutely adored the film. Like, she loved it. When she heard that they were doing an American remake, she was actually mad about it. And I think I think that shows that this film is something that people could be into if it was given a good release and not just remade. But people don't want to see dubbed or subbed films. Fucking assholes. 2016, we also got Nurse Jill from Peter Romeo Lambert. This movie is one of the few examples of a film that really captures that cheap 70s horror feel. It was shot on 16mm. It's a surreal kind of silent film that is a mix of like John Waters kind of gross out absurdist humor with a bit of like kind of giallo and slasher film inspired elements, essentially having to do with this nurse Jill, believe it or not, who is struggling, going through a very recent messy divorce. She's recovering from it, and she ends up making a new friend, and she starts to think that somebody may be stalking her. And this somebody, may or may not be a sadistic rapist that's on the loose. It's an interesting art house, kind of nightmarishly beautiful tribute to 70s exploitation and giallo films and silent horror. It wasn't even intended to be a silent film originally, but they just kind of went with that. Let's see. Also from 2016... I'm trying to stop. I really want to stop having to say the year every time I get to another film, but I can't help it. Also in 2016, we got The Void, which is a movie that not a lot of people really like for some reason. I mean, I know why. It's kind of hard to explain why, but the big problem is it's a cosmic horror film that's trying to be like The Thing, but the problem is The Thing is an alien. It's something that's easy to comprehend in its own context, in its own rules. It has its boundaries, But when it comes to cosmic horror, if you try to make the cosmic horror itself the main antagonist, it kind of falls flat because all you have to go on is it's impossible to understand. And I completely understand why people don't like The Void and think it's not a very good movie. However, I saw this film in a theater when it came out, and my opinion will always be that this movie is legitimately very intense and fun and violent and just absolutely fucking wild. I'd not seen a movie this like wild and effects driven in the theater in a very long time, and I was very happy I went to see it in the theater. And I've had people complain to me saying, oh, well, the ideas of the horror are half-baked, and I can completely agree with that upon rewatching it a few times. It's definitely not as good as it was when I saw it in the theater, but I stand by it, and I say that this is a film that you just have to be cool with. You just have to sit back, relax, and let it happen, and you have to seeing this film in a theater, I think, is the perfect way to experience it. And unfortunately, this film didn't get a wide release. We had Shin Godzilla the same year, which was Toho's big return to making Godzilla films after the 2014 American Godzilla movie kind of sparked a bit of interest. This was the first Godzilla movie in a very long time. I want to say definitely over 10 years. And they get Hideaki Anno as the director, who is the fucking madman behind Evangelion. Now, the series of Evangelion, I'm not a very big fan of, but the film, the feature film ending to Evangelion, End of Evangelion, is a film that I think is legitimately, I believe is like a near perfect film. It's one of the most interesting and depressing, just wild as hell animated films I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's kind of a shame it doesn't have a US Blu-ray release for some fucking reason. Although it is on Netflix now, so I guess that's kind of cool. But they got this guy to do their big reboot of Godzilla, and it's got to be like the second best Godzilla movie behind the original. I mean, the original is really great, and the only reason I hold it higher is because it's an absolute classic. But after the first Godzilla film, the rest of them didn't really have much of a point. Godzilla, the first film, in the film, Godzilla is a metaphor for Hiroshima. After that, it's just kind of a fun, cheesy, giant kaiju monster movie battle series. And don't get me wrong, I love those things. I love these kinds of movies, but I kind of like, movies that do try to have some substance to them. And Shin Godzilla is exactly that. I remember seeing reviews for the film when it came out from US critics who didn't really get what the film was going for. They're like, man, why is there so much focus on these politicians, like, talking about what they should do about this problem, while the problem is literally destroying the city behind them? And that's, people didn't understand why that was there. And the thing is, it's supposed to be, the film itself is basically is basically a comedy. In Japan, this film won, like, their equivalent of Best Picture. But the film is kind of supposed to be a comedy. Apparently in Japan, people were laughing in the theaters at this movie. Because it's supposed to be about how poorly the Japanese government handled that problem with the radiation leak that happened a while ago. Definitely a while ago. But that radiation leak has since made, like, a pretty decent section of the country completely uninhabitable. So, yeah, there's that. They also, the new design of Godzilla I really like. Like, they actually made him an abomination again. He's not very aesthetically pleasing at all. This is like a very expensive, like, $170 Shin Godzilla figure that I bought at a convention because, I have no control over myself. But you see, he's got these the little like T-Rex arms. His fucking tail is like absolutely just the fucking longest thing ever. He's a legitimate monstrosity again, and that's what he was supposed to be in the original film. But still, now he's a disgusting monstrosity again, and I love it. Let's see. We also got Raw the same year, which was one of my favorites for that year. It was on my best of the year list. Really great kind of feminist narrative horror film, essentially about a girl who goes to college and, experiences life quite a bit, She experiences things in life, and she's a vegetarian. She's in school to be a veterinarian, and she ends up eating raw rabbit liver for an initiation, for part of initiation into the class. And after that, she grows this insatiable hunger for flesh. It's an interesting movie, and it's got a lot of stuff in it that is surprising. I think the most interesting thing about this movie, at least other than what goes on in the movie, like surrounding the movie, is that they were giving out barf bags and stuff for this film when it came out because people were like fainting in the theater because it was so grotesque. But like This was in the Netherlands or something, so it kind of it's really not that bad in terms of its gore. It's just kind of, a cultural thing, I guess. I don't know. We also got Plank Face, which I'm just gonna not even try to talk about Plank Face. I'm going to link my video in the description. I did a analysis video on Plank Face because I legitimately believe it's a near perfect subversion of the horror film, of the slasher genre. Um, let's see. And the last film for 2016 is The Love Witch, which is a film that looks and plays like a 60s, 70s horror film. It legitimately looks and feels like a film from the 70s. Other than the fact that there is a cell phone in like one scene, the movie is pretty much completely dead on in its visual aesthetic. And it also has this really nice, like, really beautiful, perfect set and costume design, also done by the director of the film. She did the set design and the costume design on top of writing and directing this film. And it looks like the cover of like 60s pulp magazines. It's so beautiful. Like, I absolutely adore the aesthetics of this film. The plot is also pretty good too. It has to do with a witch who is, trying to find a man to fall in love with, and she keeps using love potions on these men and sleeping with them. And these love potions kind of don't pan out too well sometimes. And that's kind of the basic plot of the film. 2017, we got Get Out, which was the directorial debut of Jordan Peele. Do I really need to say anything about Get Out? That's kind of the one from that year that everybody was talking about. He won Best Original Screenplay at the Oscars for, which was very, very cool. But yeah, Get Out. Everybody saw that one. I don't want to talk about it. The Killing of a Sacred Deer was my favorite movie that year, though, and I saw that one when it came out. And The Killing of a Sacred Deer is just so great. It's a really great, absurdist, dark comedy, kind of psychological horror film, having to do with a cardiologist taking this young man under his wing, and this young man is kind of, sort of a fucking psychopath. It goes places that I didn't expect it to go, not in terms of like, oh, it gets super graphic and violent, but like, in the sense that it just did things that very much subverted my expectations, even for a movie from this director, who is the same guy who directed Dogtooth, which is a really great one from like 2009, as well as The Lobster and The Favorite also from the last decade, which were really great kind of comedy absurdist dramas. Let's see. In 2017, we also got It Comes at Night, which was a movie that was absolutely despised by audiences, mainly because the trailers made the film look like a supernatural horror film, but the film itself was more of a kind of pandemic, like, thriller. It's definitely not much of a horror film. There are aspects of it I really like, and I think it's legitimately a really thrilling and creepy movie, despite some aspects not being the very best it could be. We also got The Shape of Water from Guillermo del Toro, that movie where fucking, I think it's Sally Hawkins fucks a fish man. Honestly, that movie's just fucking high art, and the fact that it won Best Picture is it's beautiful. We also got The Endless that year, which was an interesting film from Aaron. I think it's Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, who are, as a writer-director team, they also starred in the film. But these guys have been directing movies for quite a while. They did a movie called Resolution, which was like kind of a movie about drug addiction, which had some kind of cosmic horror elements that were really cool. They also did the only good segment in VHS Viral, which is the segment where the skateboarding kids are killed by a bunch of skeletons, which is just so hilarious. They did Spring, which was a really good kind of body horror romance film. Horror. It was also a comedy, and this is their cosmic horror film. Uh, I don't really know what to say about this one. This one is kind of a hard one to talk about. Essentially, it is about these two guys who are played by the writers and directors, even named after them. And these two guys uh, were members of a cult when they were younger, and they end up escaping and telling the news, telling the outside world about what was going on in the cult. Like, apparently, after a certain age, everybody is castrated, and how they were eventually all going to commit mass suicide, and they all escape, and and they say all this stuff to the press about it. And years later, when they're adults, they receive a videotape in the mail from the commune that they left, this cult, and everybody's alive. Everybody's fine. It was an exaggeration. And they go there, and things exactly aren't what they seem, and there's some stuff that goes on, and yeah, it's pretty good, other than some of the effects in the final act. Those effects are a bit rough. Those digital effects, I mean. Let's see. Last movie for 2017 is November, which I put on my best of the year list for last year. I even reviewed the film. Link in the description for that review. If I reviewed any of these movies, I'll put the link in the description, whether or not I said it. But November is an Estonian fantasy horror film that is legitimately really creepy and tragic, while also being like really interesting and enjoyable in a kind of absurdist humor kind of way. There are moments in the film that genuinely remind me of the silent film Haxan, that silent film about witchcraft from the 20s. That's a very good movie. But that movie is there are moments, that really remind me of that in terms of like their visual style. The movie is shot in black and white, mind you. In terms of their visual style and kind of the context of the scene and what's going on. For instance, there is a scene where the plague is destroying nearby villages, and this village where the main characters live. The movie's like a dark fairy tale, I should also mention, but this this village where the main characters live, they're like, okay, how can we scare off the plague? And their plan is to all stand on. Their plan is to everybody get into the city hall and get on all fours, and then two people at a time like face each other, and then throw like a blanket over top of them, so that the only thing that is exposed from the blankets are their ass and legs. And their logic for that is that once the plague comes into their town, he will see that all these people here have only asses and no faces, and pity them, so he'll leave. And the funny thing is, like, I'm pretty sure it's a goat too. Like, a goat actually walks in like as the plague in the scene, and walks through and sees everybody's fucking asses, and is just like, oh, okay, and it leaves. It's so good, and there's genuinely really creepy stuff in there. There are these creatures from Estonian folklore that I've never heard of, and I'm kind of surprised I never heard of them, that are featured in the film, called krats, which are basically figures made of like sticks and garbage that you've kind of compiled together and brought to life. And yeah, the krats are fucking horrifying. They're done with stop motion, as you mentioned. Also from 2018, we got Annihilation, the second film from Alex Garland, I think is who it is. This was one of those films from a few years ago that everybody was talking about. I kind of don't even want to talk about it because I haven't talked about this film a lot, but I've seen it like 3 or 4 times. I still really like it. It was my favorite movie of 2018. Although I think Suspiria might beat it out, honestly, now that I've rewatched Suspiria a few times. Either way, it's an interesting movie, and I just kind of recommend it. let's see, what else do we got for 2018? We got Mandy from 2018, which this is Panos Cosmatos' second film, 8 years after doing Beyond the Black Rainbow. He does this movie, which is a revenge film starring Nicolas Cage, essentially with him playing a logger in the 80s, and his wife is like kidnapped by cultists and murdered, and he goes to get revenge on them, and it is like it takes away all the problems that Beyond the Black Rainbow had in terms of there being just like way too much extra shit, and it kind of takes the style of Beyond the Black Rainbow and combines it with the like plot and somewhat aesthetics of Turbo Kid, making this movie that is like, it's kind of a throwback film, but it's also a weird art house film that's very much doing its own thing. It's pretty violent, it's fun, there's some really great moments in the film, and again, one of my favorites from last year. We also had Hereditary last year. I say last year, but it's 2020 now. 2018, we had Hereditary, which was a film that I wasn't the biggest fan of. Rewatching it a couple times, I definitely appreciate it more. This problem, and that is, that is the biggest thing, is that the final act is kind of a mess, which sucks because the rest of the movie is really great. I don't even really know how to describe the plot of Hereditary, because it's basically just a film about loss and grief and death, and mental illness. It's pretty depressing. We also had in 2018 Climax, which didn't hit the U.S. until 2019, but I saw Climax when it came out in theaters, and I did a review on it. Link is in the description, because I feel like I can explain it a bit better. If it's, I feel like my reaction, like literally right after seeing the movie, it gives better explanation as to why it is one of the best horror films of the last decade, more than just me sitting here now trying to recall that memory from almost a year ago. We also got Suspiria, which again, link in the description to my review. My review is another one where it's like, I kind of can't really do it justice as is. You have to see the review. Although I will say there are things that I mentioned in the review that, at least in the spoiler section of that review, where I've changed my mind on and I've kind of grown to appreciate about the film. No spoilers. Finally, getting into 2019, the only horror films I can really think of for 2019 that I thought were like great and really worth mentioning are Midsommar, which is the director Ari Aster, his follow-up to Hereditary, which is a very like polar opposite film, at least in its visuals. Kind of a interesting folk horror pagan film, basically about people that get swept up with a pagan cult and bad things happen. I've also got to mention that I'm talking about the director's cut, because the director's cut is actually like a bit better than the theatrical version, which is still a good movie, mind you. 2019 also gave us, I guess, I'm going to go ahead and say, the Salska Sisters remake of Rabid, David Cronenberg's Rabid. Rabid is the original film by Cronenberg. It is a really cool movie. It's an interesting kind of mixture of zombie and body horror, and kind of pandemic, like virus contagion horror. It's a pretty good movie on its own. I'm not going to sit here and lie. I own it on Blu-ray. I think it's a good movie. However, the remake, I think, has a bit more going on in terms of kind of social commentary and messaging. And I think it does a better job of, like, setting up this kind of weird zombie virus body horror thing that the original had going on. The original film, basically how it all starts is somebody gets into a motorcycle accident right outside this facility in the middle of nowhere where they need medical test subjects. And they're like, okay, well, people are dying in the street outside, let's bring them in and do experiments on them. And that's basically how it starts in the original film, and that's the opening scene. In this remake, that part of the movie does not come along until, I want to say, maybe 15 to 20 minutes into the movie. And even then, the only reason that the main character even ends up, kind of contracting this virus and spreading it is not because she happened to get into a car or to a motorcycle accident outside of this facility. She actually goes to this facility because they are like, hey, we're testing this new facial reconstructive surgery, this new method of like plastic surgery and facial reconstruction, and we need test subjects. And we heard that your face got absolutely fucking destroyed in that motorcycle accident, so how about you give us a shot? And that's basically how it happens. Like, she's actually offered it because they need somebody to, kind of try this out on, and she has nothing to lose at that point. And that, I think, is a better setup. You also have to add into the fact that you get to know this character before this stuff happens to her, so you actually feel something when she gets into the car, this motorcycle accident and everything. The film, I just think, has more going on than people are giving it credit for. I'm seeing all these negative reviews, and I'm just like, guys, I mean, look, it isn't a perfect movie, but neither was Cronenberg's version, honestly. And yeah, it's just really good, and I think it might be the Soul Sisters' best film so far. As much as I don't enjoy it as much as Dead Hooker in a Trunk, but it's a better film than Dead Hooker in the Trunk. And that's why I'm actually featuring it on this, because it's like miles ahead in terms of quality. If it wasn't called Rabid, I feel like people would actually appreciate it a bit more. Either way, good movie, good kind of feminist horror film. And the Solska sisters are absolute babes. They have cameos in the movie. And I absolutely love the Solska sisters. They're very beautiful, and I follow them on Twitter, and I'm very entertained by some of their tweets. Anyway, on to the final movie for 2019, and I think everybody sees this one coming. It's The Lighthouse. The fucking Lighthouse. And again, I don't even want to talk about this one because everybody is talking about The Lighthouse. Don't get me wrong. Great movie, one of my favorites of the year. But I just kind of don't want to talk about it as much. So, link in the description to the review of The Lighthouse that I did when I saw it. Because my opinion is still pretty much the same as it was then. But I think that is going to do it for the best of the decade list. This was pretty much twice the length of the worst of list. And I think that shows that we have a lot of really good, talented directors that are working, these days, that are working, that have been working, and then we just got good shit. We got good shit this last decade. So I think we should, celebrate the good shit. Especially the good, more underappreciated shit. Like The Love Witch, which, I don't hear too many people talk about. Or, Nurse Jill. Or The Blackcoat's Daughter. Or, I guess Rabid. I'm gonna go ahead and say Rabid. I know I just sucked that movie's dick for 30 minutes, but I'm gonna do it anyway. But I'm gonna say it anyway. Anyway, guys, that's it. That's it for this. Next video might be the best of the year list for 2019. I don't know. I'm kind of feeling worn out on talking about the best movies of certain years, and I think I'm gonna take a bit of a break before I do my best of the year list for 2019. Anyway, guys, that's it. This is Biscuit Horror Reviews, signing off. Peace.